What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The UCLA Bruins are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what UCLA did in 2024. Here are my projections and predictions last year for UCLA. My projection for this team was 5-7, and then my prediction for them was also 5-7, and that's exactly what UCLA did. UCLA about where I expected them to be last year, going 5-7 overall in 2024. So yeah, it wasn't a disappointing year for UCLA. I think it was a pretty solid year for them considering they had a new head coach, and then also the schedule was pretty tough for them, and having to go 5-7, that does kind of make it for a pretty solid year because they had such a tough schedule. And you look at the schedule from last year in 2024 for UCLA. First off, in the non-conference, they played on the road at Hawaii, a Group of 5 team there, and then they also had to play Fresno State, a decent quality Group of 5 team there as well, and they actually played them in the last game of the regular season, which was really weird for them to do. But then they also played LSU out of the SEC, so yeah, that was really tough playing the LSU Tigers on the road out of the SEC, so that made the non-conference schedule a little bit tougher here for UCLA. And this was also their first year in the Big Ten. You look at their schedule in the Big Ten last year, first off in their home games. They had Indiana, Oregon, Minnesota, Iowa, and USC. So a pretty tough home schedule. You know, Indiana ended up being like a very underrated team last year. And then obviously Oregon was really, really good. Minnesota was a decent team. And then Iowa and USC, they were like average teams, but you know, solid teams nonetheless. They beat Iowa, but they only won one game last year at home in the Big Ten, and that came against the Hawkeyes. And then on the road in the Big Ten, they played at Penn State, at Rutgers, at Nebraska, and then at Washington. So they had a pretty tough road schedule as well, but they beat Rutgers and Nebraska. Those were two big wins there on the road for UCLA. You know, Rutgers and Nebraska were pretty solid teams last year, so having to beat both of those teams, yeah, that really helped out UCLA in order to kind of make a chance to make it to a bowl game still. But, you know, losing to Washington and USC, if they would have won one of those two games there, they probably would have made it to a bowl game and probably went 6-6 last year. But either way, it was a 5-7 year for UCLA. What does the schedule look like for 2025? Here is that schedule for the Bruins, and before we go game by game, let's take a look at who UCLA will play in the non-conference this season. So you look at their non-conference schedule. They will, of course, play Utah out of the Big 12, I should say. I was getting ready to say the Pac-12 because this is a former Pac-12 matchup here between these two West teams here. Again, both of these teams used to play in the Pac-12 against each other, but this time they're playing as non-conference opponents, and they do play them at home. So yeah, that does favor well here for the Bruins, and Utah wasn't really good last year. So this kind of, you know, decides who is going to have a really good season the rest of the way, and then probably who has, like, not a disappointing year, but just a pretty average year. But the rest of the non-conference games, you got UNLV on the road, a decent Group of 5 team last year, and then you got New Mexico. I don't really know much about New Mexico. I don't know if they're a decent quality Group of 5 team or not. But yeah, UNLV is not going to be an easy one. They lost their head coach, I get that, but they may not be as good as they were last year. But they got Dan Mullen coming in here. He's a veteran coach, and he has done a pretty good job as an offensive kind of guy. So, yeah, UNLV definitely will be a tough one here for UCLA, and especially playing on the road, but not a tough non-conference schedule. Let's go back, or actually let's take a look at their home games here in the Big Ten. They will play against Penn State, Maryland, Nebraska, and Washington. So they play 4 home games in the Big Ten this year. Penn State definitely going to be the toughest, you know, home game here. I don't know if UCLA will have a pretty good shot in this game or not. Again, Penn State's a very talented team. They got a lot of production coming back, and they could possibly be a top 5 and also a top 10 preseason type team, and they're definitely a playoff contender. But you look at the rest of the home games, Maryland, Nebraska, and Washington, these are all winnable winnable games here for the Bruins. Maryland obviously wasn't really good last year. Nebraska, they beat them. This time they will play them at home this year. And then Washington definitely will be a big revenge game here for the Bruins, and I think they'll come out really fired up in that one. So, yeah, the home schedule sets up pretty well here for UCLA. I mean, I know they struggled last year at home, but they have a pretty good chance to win 3 home games, and that Penn State game, again, is going to be pretty tough for them. Let's now move on to their away games in the Big Ten as well. They will play on the road at Northwestern, at Michigan State, at Indiana, then Ohio State, and then on the road at USC. So a very tough road schedule here for UCLA. Northwestern and Michigan State, those are very winnable games here for the Bruins. Both of those teams were not really good, but Northwestern was not really good. Michigan State was about the same thing as the Bruins last year. We'll see if they can improve here with their second-year head coach. And then obviously Indiana. That's going to be a tough game on the road, in my opinion, to win. And again, I know Indiana's not going to be quite as good as they were last year, but Kirksanetti knows how to get it done here in the transfer portal. So yeah, Indiana will once again be pretty good. And then obviously Ohio State, that's going to be the toughest road game, in my opinion. And then obviously USC is a rivalry game. I mean, they can absolutely win that game, but the Trojans, maybe they're slightly more talented. So again, quite a bit of a tough road schedule here for UCLA for 2025. Let's go back to the schedule now and go full game by game now for the Bruins. Again, they'll kick things off with Utah on August 30th at home, and then they play UNLV on September 6th on the road. Then they got New Mexico at home on September 13th. So they play all 3 of their non-conference opponents in the first 3 weeks, and then they get a bye week before jumping into Big Ten play. They'll go on the road to play Northwestern on September 27th. Then it's back at home for Penn State on October the 4th, and it's back on the road to play Michigan State on October the 11th. Maryland at home on October 18th, then on the road at Indiana on October 25th, and then they get their second bye week before playing Nebraska at home on November 8th. Then they go back on the road to play Ohio State on November 15th, Washington at home on November 22nd, and then November 29th they'll close things out on the road at USC. So you look at the schedule for UCLA, it's once again a pretty tough schedule. Again, you got Ohio State on the road. That's obviously going to be the toughest road game test here for UCLA. Penn State at home, that'll definitely be their toughest home game. Indiana obviously is a team that you don't want to sleep on, and then USC, of course, in the rivalry. But no back-to-back road games here for the Bruins, which is really good news. This schedule is kind of like home and away. It's kind of like, you have a home game from last week, and then next week you got a road game, and then you got a home game again. So this schedule does set up pretty well here for UCLA. And then also a bunch of winnable games here for the Bruins for 2025. Well, let's now get a projection here for the Bruins. This is the scale I'll be officially using for their official projection. Basically a 1% game in the red, that's pretty much counted as an automatic loss. And then your 20% games in the orange, that's where UCLA will be about a double-digit underdog. 40% in the yellow, that's where they'll be a clear underdog by less than a touchdown, 6 or 7 points. 50-50 games will obviously stay in the white, games that really can go either way. And then your 60% games in the purple, that's where UCLA will be favored by less than a touchdown, so 6 or 7 points. And then your 80% games in the blue, that's where they'll be favored by double digits. And then obviously the green games at 99% are pretty much your guaranteed, and also your automatic wins in this projection. So we'll start with those easy wins here for UCLA, and really you only got one of those, and that's New Mexico here on September 13th. Again, I mentioned earlier, I don't know how good New Mexico is out of the group of 5 level. I don't know if they're decent enough or not, but this is a game that UCLA definitely should be able to win, and they have no business to lose. It would be a big shock if they were to lose to New Mexico, but maybe it wouldn't shock me if they did lose to UNLV on the road, which I'll get to in just a minute. But yeah, New Mexico, I think UCLA will be favored in this one. That game definitely over that 95 to 99% range. And now I'm going to put the UNLV game here in the blue for now, just because it's on the road and what UNLV did last year. They are a decent group of 5 team. Again, they're not going to be as good as they were last year, but with Dan Mullen coming in with plenty of experience as a coach and everything, that's going to make UNLV a pretty tricky game here on the road on September 6th. It's definitely kind of an early trap game here for the Bruins for, in my my opinion, for 2025. So yeah, those two games, UCLA will be favored in both of them. The New Mexico game is definitely an automatic win, but the blue game, it's also counted as a win, but it's not really a guaranteed win, just like the green games are. So yeah, UCLA will be favored by 17 plus against New Mexico, and then they'll probably be favored just by 10 points or even 14 against UNLV on the road. And then you look at the rest of the schedule, there's not really any other games on here where you can favor UCLA by less than a touchdown, because most of their games are going to be probably underdogs in some of them. They're not in the red, though. I do have 3 games, though, in the orange. I think UCLA is going to be double-digit underdogs against Penn State, Indiana, and Ohio State. These are 3 tough road games here for UCLA. You know, Penn State, obviously, I know that's a home game. It probably should be in the yellow, but Penn State's definitely going to be a top 10 team, a top 5 team. They're definitely more talented, and they definitely got a lot more skilled players than the Bruins do. And again, playing at home, that does give UCLA quite a bit of a chance, but not quite enough. So I think UCLA will definitely be a double-digit underdog in this one. And then Indiana, just because it's on the road, that's the reason why it drops into the orange. And then Ohio State, that's obviously a game that UCLA definitely not have a chance to win in. So yeah, these 3 games, UCLA will be double-digit underdogs in all 3 of them by 10 to 14 points. And then I got one game here in the yellow, and that's going to be rival USC on the road here on November 29th. I think the Bruins will be about 6 or 7 point underdogs against USC. I know this is a rivalry game. Anything can happen in this one. But if it was at home here for the Bruins, it would definitely be in the white as a 50-50 game. But because it's on the road and USC beat UCLA last year, that's the reason why it does turn into a yellow game. But because it's in the yellow, that does give them a pretty good chance. It's definitely a lot more of a bigger chance that UCLA can win this game instead of the orange game. So yeah, UCLA will be a 6 or 7 point underdog here against the Trojans on the road on November 29th. And then that's going to leave you with 6 total 50-50 games that are pretty even matchups in my opinion. You got Utah, Northwestern, Michigan State, Maryland, Nebraska, and Washington. You know, Northwestern and Michigan State, don't know how good those 2 teams are going to be this year. I mean, they were not really good last year. We'll see if they can turn things around in 2025. Same thing for Utah. Maryland, we'll see how good they are as well. You know, Nebraska and Washington, those are pretty solid teams, but they're playing at home in both of those games, and definitely UCLA has a pretty good chance in both of them. So these 6 games right here in the 50-50 range can really go either way. So what does the projected record come out to be here for UCLA based on how tough this schedule is? Well, against New Mexico, you count that as a win, and then you also count the UNLV game as a win as well, and then you count the 3 games in the orange as losses. You average out that 1 game in the yellow at 40%, and then average out these 6 50-50 games at 50%. That's going to give you a total of 6 50-50 games. Again, I think they probably split them. They probably win like 3 out of the 6, and then plus you got your 1 win against UNLV and New Mexico. That's going to give you 5 total wins. So that is what the projection is for UCLA. It's going to be 5-7 for 2025. I think that's a pretty fair projection based on how tough this schedule is. Again, it's a very, very tough schedule. The projection would be a lot lower if this schedule probably had Oregon and Michigan both on the schedule. And the fact that they got to play Penn State and Ohio State both on the schedule, I mean, one of them is at home at least, but those are going to be 2 tough games. They'll definitely be big underdogs in both of those games, although they can have a pretty good chance to beat USC, and that would probably give them the 6 wins. If they were somehow to, win 3 out of these 6 50-50 games and then probably pull off a huge win on the road at USC, that'll definitely give them a 6 wins. So they're going to have to at least win 4 or, maybe like 3 of these 50-50 games and then probably, beat USC on the road in order to have a chance here to make it to a bowl game. So yeah, 6-6, I think best case scenario right now is making it to a bowl game, and then worst case probably like 4-8 or 3-9. If they go 4-8 or 3-9, that's definitely a disappointing year, but I wouldn't be shocked if they went 5-7 just because of how tough this schedule is. Again, it's not one of the toughest schedules in the country, but it definitely makes them go 5-7 as a projection as of right now. So that is my projection for UCLA for 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree with this projection? And let me know your thoughts about UCLA down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.